Hi everyone, welcome to episode 12 of Dissemination Day, and this is a final in our series that focuses on treatments for self-injurious behaviour. Today, following on from some of the subjects that Tia was talking about in her last video, I've decided to review the following article, which is by Iwata et al. It was published in 1994 in the Journal of Applied Behaviour Analysis, but was actually reprinted from an earlier journal, The Analysis and Intervention in Developmental Disabilities, back in 1982. It was first published. The title of the article is Toward a Functional Analysis of Self-Injury, and it's really quite a seminal, quite famous article that focuses on self-injurious behaviour, but from the point of view of a functional analysis, and it's one of the earliest forms of functional analysis within the literature. So that's where I thought it would be quite useful to sort of pick that apart and look at sort of its implications for the analysis and treatment of self-injurious behaviour, among other forms of challenging behaviour. So why I've chosen this article, as I say, it's leading on from the subject matter that Tia was talking about during the last video, where she mentioned that distinction between functional behavioural assessment and functional analysis, and spoke a little bit about the fact that actually we use those terms interchangeably, but they're very different things. So I thought it would be useful to cover in a bit more detail what we mean by the term functional analysis. We are going to focus from a self-injurious behaviour perspective, bringing the focus in to taking a functional perspective to treatments for self-injury. As I say, it's a very famous, very well-known article, and it's one that I think it's useful for practitioners and people who are working in the field of behaviour analysis to understand and be familiar with. One thing before we sort of get into the content, though, is it's really important to bear in mind, if you're thinking about carrying out a functional analysis, you do need to make sure that you follow the ethical guidelines that are in place, and also ensure that you are having regular clinical supervision to sort of oversee those practices. So we'll look now at the background surrounding this particular piece of research. Within the introduction, the authors recognise the fact that previous research has been primarily focused around simply the elimination of self-injurious behaviour, rather than on actually finding solutions that address self-injury from a functional perspective. This has meant that interventions have commonly been based around punishment procedures, where aversive stimuli have been presented to reduce the frequency of that behaviour going forward. The authors recognise that no single form of treatment is going to be effective for everybody, and the most effective treatment will be determined by an understanding around which events are currently actually maintaining the behaviour. So actually understanding what function that behaviour serves for each individual. So Iwata and his colleagues wanted to design a form of analysis that would basically manipulate the environment and then measure the effects that those manipulations had on self-injurious behaviour. They focused on 9 children, each with a diagnosis of a developmental delay, and each of which was documented as engaging in moderate to high rates of self-injurious behaviour, including head banging, arm biting, self-choking, ear pulling, a whole range of different forms. Each of those children have been admitted to an inpatient centre for evaluation due to the level of their self-injurious behaviour. And important to note as well that any sort of health concerns or organic factors had been ruled out as a cause for that self-injurious behaviour. They took some precautions, ensuring that nobody engaged in any forms of behaviour that could result in immediate risk of severe physical damage. Clear criteria were put in place for around the termination should the behaviour escalate to a dangerous level. And all the children involved were carefully monitored by a nurse throughout, just in case there were any particular concerns. Prior to the commencement of the analysis, the self-injurious behaviour was clearly operationally defined, so that's where a very clear structured definition was put in place around exactly which behaviour was to be measured, what that looked like, so that anybody measuring that behaviour would make the same judgments around whether it had occurred or not. Several 15-minute sessions took place over 4 different conditions, which were presented in a random order to eliminate those order effects. So the 4 different conditions, we'll sort of have a look at those now and what they actually specifically were. So the first one was a social disapproval condition. This was designed to test for an attention function for that self-injurious behaviour. Within this condition, adults were present who were reading a book, and when the child engaged in self-injurious behaviour, they gave a social disapproval response, something along the lines of "don't do that, you'll hurt yourself." And they then also engaged in a small level of physical interaction, a non-restrictive sort of hand on the shoulder kind of reaction. The second condition was an academic demand condition, and this was designed to test for a potential escape function, and this is where an educational activity was presented that the child might find boring and uninteresting. If the child engaged in self-injurious behaviour, the task was removed basically for 30 seconds. The unstructured play condition was designed to be a control. This is what we describe as an enriched environment, an environment where there were plenty of toys, there was adult attention, and there were no particular responses to self-injurious behaviour. The final condition was the alone condition, which was designed to test for a sensory or automatic function. This was where the child was alone in a room that was lacking in stimulation. There was no access to toys or any form of interaction. So unsurprisingly, they found a wide variety of difference from participant to participant in relation to their levels of self-injurious behaviour over those 4 different conditions. So we look now at some of the graphs that plot that information. You can see on the screen here there's 4 different children's data that's been put into line graph format, and each of the different lines refers to a different condition within that functional analysis. Child 2 and child 5, there's very little sort of difference between the 4 different conditions. You might describe that as an undifferentiated result, not a clear result in terms of behavioural function. However, child 1 and child 4, to the left of this graph, there appears to be a very clear condition during which that child engaged in the highest level of self-injurious behaviour. So for child 1, we can see a higher level of self-injurious behaviour in the academic condition. This is where the child might be engaging in self-injurious behaviour to access an escape from a particular demand that they're trying to avoid. Child 4, a slightly different response there. The highest levels of self-injurious behaviour occurred when the alone condition was enforced. This might imply a sensory or automatic function for that child's self-injurious behaviour in this case. Overall, the analysis found that the highest number of children appeared to be engaging in self-injurious behaviour to meet a sensory function. So 4 of the children engaged in the most self-injurious behaviour during the alone condition. Next down was the academic demand condition, where 2 of the children appeared to be engaging in self-injurious behaviour to gain that escape, and only 1 child appeared to be engaging in self-injurious behaviour to gain access to attention, that social disapproval from an adult, which actually is quite surprising, as the authors state in their article. Social attention is one of the most frequently assumed, I'd say, functions for forms of challenging behaviour, but particularly self-injurious behaviour. And actually this particular analysis is suggesting that it's one of the least frequent forms of function for that group of participants. So we'll discuss some of the implications for this particular study now, and then sort of widen it out to look a bit at the current context around functional analysis. So Iwata talks about the fact that finding function is so crucial, and that actually they've been able to pilot a method through which that function can be identified experimentally, and actually a functional hypothesis can be confirmed, through that environmental manipulation. They speak about the fact that non-function based interventions may actually on some occasions have the opposite effect and may make behaviour worse. Because, for example, if you decide that you're going to withdraw attention because you're assuming somebody's self-injurious behaviour has an attention function, then that's only going to make the behaviour much more established if it does in fact have an escape function. Function-based interventions are found to be more effective than non-function-based interventions within the literature, and self-injurious behaviour treatment needs to be tailored for every child. And the most effective way of tailoring this particular treatment would be through actually analysing that function figuring out the reason why that person might be engaging in that behaviour for the first place. And that will lead to the highest chance of success. So we've touched on the fact that this is a very important article and one of the first research examples of a functional analysis that can then lead to a functional intervention for self-injurious behaviour. So look a little bit now at the current context around functional analysis, and we've come a long way since the early 80s when this was first published, and since the early 90s when it was published again in the Journal of Applied Behaviour Analysis. And functional analysis has also come a long way. There's been a lot of changes in that field. And it's understood now that every functional analysis doesn't need to follow the system that Iwata and his colleagues demonstrated within this particular paper. It's really important that functional approaches are used. They're a crucial component of positive behaviour support. And PBS practitioners are going out sort of every day and carrying out functional behavioural assessments to determine what the function might be of various forms of challenging behaviour. Functional behaviour assessment is traditionally seen as incorporating three different elements. The first element being an indirect assessment. So this would be your informant type assessments, carrying out questionnaires with staff members, with family members who know that person well, sometimes with the person themselves. This involves no direct observation of behaviour. The second part would be the descriptive assessment, which is where direct observations are made of the behaviour occurring, but no manipulation is made of the environment to determine the effects upon that behaviour. The third part of the functional behavioural assessment, it would be the functional analysis, one method of which obviously we described within this video, Iwata's techniques. One area that's been focused on much more recently is actually, do we need to be following this order? Is it really important that we do an informant-based assessment, a descriptive assessment? Quite often that's where the functional behavioural assessment will stop as well. Functional behavioural assessment can be a time-consuming process, and as I say, it's common practice to stop once you've done those informant-based assessments. You've got some data, you've got a nice report that you can file and that you can show to professionals. It is understood, and I think really important to stress here, that closed-ended informant-based assessments are notoriously unreliable. So I'm going to move on and talk about some of the work of a really amazing guy by the name of Greg Hanley. He actually quotes within quite an important article that he wrote in 2012, behaviour analysts can probably save a little time and be no worse off by simply omitting closed-ended indirect assessments from the functional assessment process. He's talking there about the unreliability of those processes and about the fact that actually it can potentially be a complete waste of time and you might not even be identifying the function using those processes. So I suppose the question is really, if we're saying that informant-based functional assessment is a waste of time, what do we need to be doing? How can we actually make the functional assessment process as reliable and useful as possible? Because at the end of the day, we want to focus in on what that function is so that we can make life better for those people. We can implement those functional-based approaches and improve things. Functional assessments need to be more person-centred, and more efforts need to be made to incorporate functional analysis into that process. That's the only way that that hypothesis around function can be tested. We need to make sure that we're using the most ethical methods possible when we're doing that. There are a lot of different forms of functional analysis that have been devised that can help with that. There's brief forms of functional analysis. There are functional analyses that only focus on those precursor or early warning behaviours occurring. So you stop that condition as soon as you see that those early behaviours from occurring, so that the higher level behaviours don't actually need to occur at any point during that analysis. So I want to use this video as an opportunity to talk a little bit more about Greg Hanley's work. He's designed a form of functional assessment called practical functional assessment. It was originally called a thing called an ISCA, but he's recently rebranded and made it a little bit more sort of user-friendly in terms of its name. He talks about starting with a structured but open-ended interview and a brief observation to discover potential factors that may be influencing problem behaviour, and then conduct a precise and individualised functional analysis based on the resultant information to examine the relevance of these discoveries. So he simply narrows it down to a control condition, which is described basically as an enriched environment, the environment in which that person is the least likely to be engaging in that form of challenging behaviour. And then a test condition, which would be personalised from those structured open-ended interviews as being the condition during which it's hypothesised that challenging behaviour is most likely to occur. He doesn't focus in on specific functions because he understands the fact that most behaviours have got multiple interacting functions that are quite often very sort of environmental context specific. So that the test condition and control condition are alternated. It's basically manipulating the environment to try and get into that situation where that behaviour can almost be switched on and switched off. And once that can clearly be demonstrated, it's very clear why the behaviour is occurring and what action needs to be taken in the form of intervention. So I really advise anybody in the field who hasn't explored the work of Greg Henley to look into that in much more detail. He's got a great website. I'll put the details up at the end of this video. So finally, moving on and thinking about some of sort of our considerations and feelings around functional behavioural assessment and around obviously how that can apply to self-injurious behaviour and interventions for that. I think really crucial and key are these 2 points. It needs to be person-centred and it needs to be context-specific. So as Hanley does, actually tailoring that functional assessment to the person and to the situation in which it's occurring. It shouldn't be a lengthy, drawn-out, endless process with the person waiting at the other end of that to receive some sort of effective intervention. We need to make sure that ethical approaches are followed and that we're keeping everybody involved in the process and informed. We need to make sure that we use the information we have available to us to then create constructional interventions. It's all very well doing the beautiful, shiny functional analysis and coming out with some lovely graphs and being able to go out there and say, yep, I know where that behaviour is occurring. But if we're not using that information to actually design an intervention, then it's a complete waste of time for everybody involved and hugely unethical. We need to make sure that we're designing function-based interventions that are constructional, that support the person to develop skills and to have a better quality of life. And we also, I think all of us as professionals in this field need to make sure that we're keeping ourselves up to date with the latest developments. It's a really fast-moving field. There's lots more information becoming available to us around, the best possible practices. So it's really important to keep up to date with what's going on. So again, that's another little consideration from my perspective. So I'll leave you with some references. The first one here is the article that I was citing Greg Hanley from. And at the bottom of this page, you'll see the link that links to his website, Practical Functional Assessment. If you go to that website, you'll be able to see access to a lot of the articles and a lot of the materials and videos and things like that of Greg talking about practical functional assessment and a range of other things. So I really recommend that you check that out. That's me. I'm tying up now. Thanks so much for listening. I hope it's not been too much of a whirlwind of information. And watch this space for our next series of Dissemination Day. Thank you. Bye.